Wife there. We know he will be missed. We want to talk about this next story now, a First Coast News exclusive. Questions about a police officer's credibility took center stage in court today in a high-profile murder case. Navy Chief Petty Officer Andrea Washington, mother of 3, was shot to death in her Jacksonville home back in 2018.
Now her ex-fiance is charged with her murder. He has pleaded not guilty. Today, his attorney challenged the honesty of one officer's testimony, saying the judge must throw out key evidence in this case. On your side's Ann Schindler brings us this report, which you will only see on First Coast News.
We believe, based on all the circumstances, that Officer Grunwald was not telling the truth.
Assistant Public Defender Al Chipperfield in court today saying one of the first officers on the scene of Andrea Washington's murder is not credible. Jacksonville Sheriff's Officer Kyle Grunwald testified at a hearing in November that he got consent to search and detain Danny Beard, now charged with killing Washington. That testimony different than what the officer included in his report the night of the crime and his deposition in May 2019.
The unlikelihood that he would remember facts better more than 2 years after a sworn deposition than he did at the deposition. Because by the time he mentioned consent at the hearing, he knew he was testifying in a hearing where his search had been challenged.
In court transcripts, Officer Grunwald testified fresh memories of the night started coming back to him shortly before the hearing in November. When asked if he'd told prosecutors about his new memories, Grunwald said he had.
If in fact they had learned that consent had been given by Mr. Beard, surely they would have notified the defense.
A law commonly referred to as Brady requires prosecutors to turn over any evidence that contradicts the testimony of one of their witnesses. So if Grunwald did tell them his memory of events had changed, prosecutors would have been required to tell the defense.
First and foremost, yes, that is accurate about the Brady situation.
But today, Assistant State Attorney Cameron French said Officer Grunwald did not share any of that information with prosecutors.
The first time that the state did hear of that information to be candid with the court and of course defense is during the hearing that we had before Your Honor on November the 23rd, 2020.
Whether the officer got consent to search matters because according to court documents, Grunwald found a bloody sock in Danny Beard's pocket. But with the officer's credibility in question, Beard's attorneys want the judge to suppress much of the evidence in the case.
Statements made by Mr. Beard, the cell phone seized from his car that day, all items seized from his home, DNA swabs that were collected from him.
We were unable to reach Officer Grunwald. The Jacksonville Sheriff's Office declined to comment. The judge is not expected to rule on the motion for several weeks. Ann Schindler, First Coast News, on your side.